Okay, let's talk about the advancements of negotiations, because we are supposed to, as of right now, be living in a ceasefire. Now, it might not feel like it, and it might not be working too well, but that's supposed to be the situation. We're supposed to be living in a ceasefire. Now, originally, Trump wanted a ceasefire and the peace deal before he was president. Then it became 24 hours, which was his constant campaign slogan. Then he got inaugurated, it didn't happen, and now we're well over 2 months, going into 3 months into his presidency, and we haven't even started negotiations. And the ceasefire that we have achieved, well, originally it was supposed to just be a ceasefire across the board. And then it was like, well, how about we just do a 30-day ceasefire, cut aid from Ukraine to make them do it. The Ukraine agrees, then Russia doesn't. And then from there, it's just been degraded until eventually we got, well, how about a civilian and energy ceasefire? Now, the energy angle to that, how much that actually matters, how much that helps, I don't really know. I don't think significantly. We've already passed the winter period, the time where Russia would use strikes on energy infrastructure to bring the most pressure on the civilian population. Now, strikes on energy infrastructure might actually, in some ways, benefit the Ukrainians to strike Russian energy infrastructure and its oil refineries and its production facilities and the places where Russia could, make money to continue to fund the war effort. And this year, Ukraine's supposed to have more drones than, if you believe that any of the government numbers that they publish is anywhere near correct, then the entirety of what they've produced up in this war to this point. And we're already seeing, and we saw the numbers of drone strikes continue to increase in Russia to triple digits on the daily in some instances. It was continuing to increase. So how much that really helps is up for debate. But the civilian infrastructure ceasefire, that would have been great if the Russians agreed to it. The United States said they did. Russians did not. And then they never mentioned it again. And then it became also, after some time and some effort and some violations of the ceasefire, it became also now a Black Sea Ceasefire after negotiations in Riyadh, Saudi Arabia, and a 90-minute phone call between Donald Trump and Vladimir Putin. And that ceasefire was supposed to redouble the energy ceasefire, which had failed. So basically, we're going back to that and saying, yay, that's good. And expanding this to the Black Sea so we could decrease the insurance costs and such like that. And Trump had given them permissions that not only give them protections in the Black Sea as well, but also said in exchange for this, Trump would facilitate Russia's re-entrance into the international agricultural industry. And then Russia announced that that would also include imports, and if they wanted any type of ceasefire, also the import of certain agricultural industrial goods, like big, farm equipment, maybe even agricultural drones, which do have dual military purposes, as I've seen firsthand. Trump hasn't exactly agreed to this super excitedly, but that's the state of where we are right now. And they then followed all these new demands up that they did not agree to in the negotiations with another statement. And it was that we are not in a ceasefire, according to the Russians, because it will only be a ceasefire once these things are agreed to and sanction relief is given. Then they can have a 30-day ceasefire in the Black Sea and an energy infrastructure. Not across the board. The battles on the front line will keep continuing. But if we give this relief, then we'll have a ceasefire in the Black Sea, where 50% of the Russian Navy's already been sunk, and energy infrastructure, which is divided how much it even helps the Ukrainians to begin with. But hey, at least from the Trump's position, it's a launching pad for further talks. Now, that could also be seen from a Russian position as another way to drag it out. But hey, it's a launching pad for further talks. And then we started getting some messages, not 24 hours after this was all announced. The Russian Ministry of Defense stated that the Kyiv regime continued strikes on Russia's energy infrastructure despite Zelensky's statements on March 24th. On the night of March 26, 2 Ukrainian UAVs were shot down near the coast of Crimea, with the target reportedly being ground equipment at the Hlipta gas storage facility, according to the Russian Ministry of Defense. The ministry also claimed that Kyiv, by continuing to damage Russian energy infrastructure, is doing everything possible to disrupt Russian-American agreements. Guys, it's all Ukraine's fault. Gosh, we really got to be tougher on Ukraine more, guys. Come on. Now, number one, do we know that this was targeting these electrical facilities or gas storage facilities? No, we don't. It's according to them. That's the first thing. Second thing, the Russians said that the ceasefire was not in effect. They said that the ceasefire was not in effect, that the energy ceasefire was technically in effect and continuing, and they had agreed to it on March 18th, supposedly. They're just kind of like saying stuff as it goes. But that this new one was not in effect until sanctions relief is offered. They are dragging this out at a snail's pace, step by step, and dictating every move here. When is the American administration going to dictate the moves forward, saying, hey, this is the offer, we're doing this, or we're going to go with the alternatives, which is more support for Ukraine? Because if they don't do that, what the Russians will ultimately fall back upon is, we can wait it out. It might hurt right now, but we can wait it out. We can wait it out because they don't care enough, and they're going to leave anyway. And the longer they don't send aid to Ukraine, the more beneficial from their perspective it'll get for them on the battlefield. And, you know, the lack of American support will be very negative for the troops on the front. So this is not a strategy for success. This is a repeated failure, stacked upon the failures of negotiating and then having the Russians announce something totally different than what you announced every single time. They keep saying that they believe the Russians are negotiating in good faith before the Russians immediately show them that they're not. And so Zelensky has come out and accused Russia of manipulating the conditions for a Black Sea ceasefire. Zelensky is coming out and criticizing the Russians, which is nothing new, but saying that that is manipulating the diplomatic process by how it's getting dragged out, and that this ceasefire is not because they want a ceasefire, but because they're trying to manipulate the process. Let's read from his evening address from yesterday. We see how the Russians have already started to manipulate. They are already trying to distort the agreements and actually deceive our mediators and the whole world. Following the discussions between the U.S. and Russia and Saudi Arabia, the two countries agreed on March 25th to implement a ceasefire in the Black Sea and a ban on strikes against energy infrastructure. To secure an agreement, the White House initially helped to restore Russia's access to the world market for agricultural and fertilizer exports, lowering maritime insurance costs, and enhance access to ports and payment system for such transactions. That's a lot of concessions. The Kremlin later issued a statement on March 25th, again, removing economic pressure from the Russians. Issued a statement on March 25th stating that the ceasefire in the Black Sea will take effect only after Western sanctions on Russia's Rosselbank and other financial organizations involved in supporting international food trade operations are lifted, and after connection to the SWIFT messaging system restored. This would allow them to do transactions on the international market more easily, flow more capital into Russia more easily, which could benefit their war effort if the war continues, which I still think is a more than a possibility. There are absolutely clear statements published by the White House. Everyone can see that there is something that the Kremlin is lying about again and again, that allegedly the silence in the Black Sea depends on the issue of sanctions, and that allegedly the start date for the silence in the energy sector is March 18th. Moscow always lies, the president added. Moscow is also demanding that the White House lift sanctions on Russia's food production and exporters, as well as Russia's flagged ships involved in the food and fertilizer trade. Another condition for the ceasefire is that commercial ships in the Black Sea should be inspected, according to the Kremlin. In response to the additional Russian demands, U.S. President Donald Trump said that the U.S. is looking at lifting sanctions on Russia in order to secure a Black Sea ceasefire agreement. But by the way, do you know what this means? That means we could get a ceasefire and sanctions lifted in the Black Sea But the vast majority of the deaths and the destruction would continue on the front line, meaning the Russians could drag out the war while getting sanctions relief. This is a state, a limbo. The Kremlin could say, once they've gotten into it, that at least it was better than where they were before, because they've gotten sanctions relief, even if it hasn't won them the war. At least it stopped American aid inflows and got them some sanctions relief. Already they're winning victories. This is leverage you don't want to remove. You want ultimate economic pressure until the peace deal is signed. Removing economic pressure for ceasefire deals that are like 30 days long, that's how you get your pocket stolen. That's how you get made a fool of, which Trump seems determined to do. And not to mention, we're also getting reports that in these negotiations, there is talk about territories. And you hear Steve Witkoff on Tucker Carlson's podcast saying that the referendums in Russian-occupied territory were actually legitimate, treating them legitimately. He might try to walk back it later, but Russian state TV has already ran with it. It's already been pressed in the papers. It's already a message that's been pumped out to the public. It's already degraded the United States and Ukraine's negotiating position, further making it look like it's not dedicated to Ukraine's defense, and Russia's going to behave that way. Not only its national sovereignty, but also its territory. And, you know, he talks about the disputes when it comes to this territory, and the Russians, according to certain reports, are demanding territory that they currently do not have. They're demanding the capital of Kherson, from which they were pushed out of. That means they would get over the Dnieper River, getting over one of Ukraine's strongest national defenses and reoccupying not only a city that the Ukrainians pushed them out of without a fight, but also occupying the city that they're currently hunting civilians in the human safari, as well as the city of Zaporizhia, as well as Konstantinivka, as well as Sloviansk, as well as Kramatorsk. They want to chop up all this land that has resisted them tooth and nail. And it's being discussed. And this is what Zelensky has to say to that. There are no questions about our territories. It doesn't matter what Russia says. We have no agreements on territories. But Zelensky also clarified that not only does he have no agreement on the territories, he has been given no information on territorial concessions. There's been no update. He hasn't been sent a Gmail. He hasn't been sent on a secured line. He hasn't been sent anything on Signal in any group chat either. He's been told nothing about terms of territorial conditions, and all we have to go off of is the ramblings of Steve Witkoff with that fool Tucker Carlson, as they produce propaganda that's better on Russia 1 than it would be broadcasted from the territory of the continental United States. This is from November in chat. No concessions. Peace is easy. Russia will leave Ukraine. Thanks for the awesome streams, by the way. 200 bits. Look, if we can get a peace that is sustainable peace, that's fantastic. But selling out the Ukrainian people and passing down the war to another generation down the road so you can get short-term economic benefit and open yourself up to Russia's resource wealth and buddy up to your authoritarian mates, that isn't in America's interest, that isn't in Ukraine's interest, that is in nobody's interest but Putin, his cronies, and Trump and his cronies. And let me say something. Out of all these concessions, no NATO membership, no American troop deployments, Ukraine not being at the negotiating table, so they're having these discussions about Ukrainian territory without their say right now. You know, we see concession after concession after concession. Concession after concession. And after all these concessions, after cutting aid, the only thing I've seen from the White House about issues that matter to them on the Ukrainian side that they've indicated was very recent. And they indicated a POW exchange, which, by the way, would also be important for the Russians, for them to get all their POWs back, so it's not even just a Ukraine-centric issue. The only Ukraine-centric issue that has actually been commented on by the White House as something that they are talking about with the Ukrainians, we don't even know if they've mentioned it to the Russians yet, but that they've mentioned publicly, is the kidnapped Ukrainian children that were trafficked out of Ukraine into Russia and kidnapped, where many of their families don't know where they are. And there's organizations like Save Ukraine working to save them. Well, we've got a report from the founder of Save Ukraine, Mykola Kubila, who says that these kidnapped children are being drafted into the Russian army. Many of the children Ukraine has been able to rescue have spoken about being drafted or seeing their friends drafted into the Russian army. And I quote, "Of that more than 600 kids who have been stolen in rescues, together with our partners, 40% of all boys rescued over the past year received draft notices for the Russian army or had a friend who did." He then said 70% of the children who were made to listen to Russian military personnel or security service members at school who urged the children to sign contracts with the Russian ministry. And I quote, 25% of all rescued Ukrainian children or their classmates were forced to march and handle weapons and shoot. Every fifth rescued child had a gun pointed at them. We know that these children had been, as they were coming of age, been pushed to join into the armed services. We didn't know some of these statistical details that's being pushed by the Safe Ukraine founder, but we knew this was going on. And we also knew that for a while that Russia's been pushing people in occupied territories into service. Many of those killed and a lot of these human wave attacks in eastern Ukraine are Ukrainians in occupied territories in the 40s, 50s, and 60s, pressed into service against international law. You're not allowed to press people in occupied territories into military service. That's illegal. They don't care. Did it anyway. And then they went and charged against Ukrainian machine guns. It's really horrible. Getting Ukrainians to mow down other Ukrainians forced to fight them, forced to conquer their neighbors. And so this is the one issue that we've heard anything that they've even talked about it. How much movement have we actually gotten? The only movement I've heard is the operations to save them done by organizations like Save Ukraine, or them getting moved around continuously in Russia as they continue to get older, as the war continues to go on 3 years. And the longer the war goes on, the more opportunities they will have to press more Ukrainian children trafficked out of Ukraine into the army to fight against Ukrainians. And this type of diplomacy that the Trump administration is engaged in is just going to encourage more of the type of tactics that Putin's been using. Just restating the position over and over and over. The old Molotov tactic of just restating the position until eventually they cave, which seems to have worked wonders on Steve Witkoff. Or them agreeing to one thing then announcing another thing. Well, here's how bold and bodacious that it's currently gotten. There is talk of Nord Stream. Lavrov eyes Russia-U.S. energy cooperation. Nord Stream. Remember Donald Trump back in the day, one of the main defenses people would use for him to say he's not controlled by the Russians. This Russiagate stuff's all nonsense. He's much tougher on the Russians. Remember, he was the one who criticized Germany and went after Angela Merkel for Nord Stream, for the energy control the Russians were able to develop over Europe. Well, now the foreign minister of Russia is saying, well, maybe we can get the United States to make the Europeans, to be clear, the United States makes the Europeans restart Nord Stream and start trading fuel. So America would be pushing Europe to become energy reliant back on the Russians, instead of taking, for example, American LNG export instead. Let me read this to you. Russian Foreign Minister Sergei Lavrov claimed on March 26 today that resuming Russian energy supplies to Europe is in the interest of both Moscow and Washington, alleging discussions about Nord Stream pipelines, state-owned news agency TASS reported. Now, of course, there are disagreements, but the interest is in restoring normal energy supplies to Europe is not the interest of the United States and Russia alone, Lavrov said. There is talk about Nord Stream. It will probably be interesting if the Americans use their influence on Europe and force it to not give up Russia gas. Let me read that again. The Americans use their influence on Europe to force it to not give up Russian gas. Look how much the conversation has shifted. See, the thing is, it's not going to be, hey guys, we moved a little bit over to the Russian position, so they're going to move a little bit over to our position and compromise. No, we moved over a lot towards the Russian position, and so they've moved forward. Now it's not just, hey, let's have peace in Ukraine, you give us all this land, you demilitarize Ukraine, you make it so it'd be easy for us to invade it again. Oh, and before we even consider any future military operations or a future foreign policy agenda, how about you also all become economically reliant on us again? So that if you were ever to break with us again, you'd have the same energy troubles you had last time. How is Donald Trump going to force Europe to be reliant on the Russians for energy? How is he going to argue that after arguing against Nord Stream for so long? How could he argue that after arguing the Europeans need to take their own defense more seriously? How is he going to argue that they should take Russian energy exports instead of American LNG exports from an American interest perspective? He can't. He can't. And I doubt he will. This is a line where I honestly don't think he'll cross, because it would just look too silly, too stupid, too ridiculous, and so weak that I think his 27% of Americans who think he's going to bring peace in Ukraine will go down to 20. But it just shows you that it's, you know, what's that old saying? Give an inch, take a mile. The Russians have decided to take half of the Atlantic. Do you guys want some good news? We do have some good news. The good news is this footage right here. Do you guys see what this is?